Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Fred Varco. I am co-chair of the Professional Activities Committee, and we're very honored to have His Excellency Laurent Pic, French ambassador, here to speak to us. Before we start, can everybody turn off their telephones so we don't have music during the press conference? And Ambassador Pic will speak for around 15 minutes, and then we'll be open to questions, initially from the working press, and then open to one and all. A quick look over Ambassador Pic's bio. He joined the Foreign Affairs Ministry in 1993, was previously in charge of EU development policy and later became Secretary General of European Affairs at the Prime Minister's office. He was appointed ambassador to Japan in June of this year. I believe he was appointed by the previous president, but confirmed by the current president. The current president, who was referred to in the Daily Telegraph yesterday as becoming dismally unpopular. Ambassador Pic has been here since June the 10th, so he's relatively new to Japan, but I'm sure he has a lot of information about Japan-French relations, Japan-EU relations, and my favorite topic, Brexit. Ambassador Pic, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farco, for presenting me. That's true that my career has been mostly concentrating on the EU affairs, but I've been doing a lot of other things in the ministry, including serving in New York in the United Nations mission, French mission to the UN, and also being a diplomatic advisor to the Prime Minister and Chief of Staff of the former Foreign Minister. I'm very happy to be in front of you today. The Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan is a very valuable institution with which the French Embassy has a strong relationship, and I'm very happy to continue in the traditions of my predecessors to come to you and also present you the current status of affairs in France and the view that we have of the world affairs, and of course talking to you about the relationship that fronts us with Japan. Well, I would like to start, of course, by coming back to the point of departure. You mentioned that I was appointed by François Hollande. That is true, because I was appointed in February. But my appointment was confirmed by President Macron, and my credentials to the Emperor were signed by President Macron, so I'm a fully fledged ambassador, don't worry. And I'm here, of course, to represent the French government and the French president, who is now in New York, like Mr. Abe, for the General Assembly. Maybe to come back to what happened in France beginning of this year. Well, there was a very important election, the presidential election, which in this year took a special turn, and these elections saw Mr. Macron was an outsider at the beginning being elected, and he was elected on the basis of a clear discussion in my country about the path that we should follow, whether to have an inward-looking France, retracted behind its borders, thinking that the way to protect itself and to defend its interests is to be alone, or on the contrary, a France that has made the clear choice of openness, of a strong Europe, and of course of a multilateral system based on rules that needs to be changed, adapted, or strengthened to defend its interests and its views. The clear choice which was made by the French president and many countries outside of France, most of its partners were really looking with anxiety to what would take place in France. I remember it very well when our ministers were traveling around the world. The questions that they were asked by their counterparts were quite anxious, and many people saw France as a new domino falling after Brexit, of course, and after also what took place in the United States, to populism, and this was not the choice of the French people. The French people has a capacity to surprise, and in this circumstance, that's what he did, by electing a president elected on a clear choice, which is a choice of transformation of my country, because my country needs to reform itself if it wants to be strong in the world and also face the challenges that we have to face. He made also the choice, the French people, of a country active in Europe, in favor of stronger Europe, and for that carrying a reform agenda for the European Union. And I will give you some details of what we have in mind and what the President has described not so long time ago in Athens when he delivered a speech on the occasion of his visit to Greece. And also France made the choice of once again a commitment to the international society, to an international community based on rules, with the free trade also based on rules, based on values, that we need to organize through multilateral discussions, multilateral negotiations. So there is an agenda of transformation, some reforms, which the President wants to carry out effectively and rapidly. And the reforms have already started. The first of the reform was to bring some more transparency to our political life, and the law has been signed last week by the President. So this has been done already. And now what is going on in France is the reforms about the labor market, which needs to be more flexible so that we create more dynamism in the economy, that we solve also the problem of unemployment that we have, and that we also use the good economic situation that we face at the moment with a good growth to carry out those reforms. And these reforms are now on the process. The President has decided to legislate by ordinance, which is a speedier way of carrying out reforms. But of course, these ordinances have been already ratified, or the principle of them have been ratified by the Parliament, and the Parliament will intervene to confirm them. And so this reform will be done. So you were discussing about the popularity of the President. I think that the popularity is something that is coming and going, and you are all following the Japanese affairs currently, and you know that in a few months' time the things can change a lot, and that can also create some political impact. So I think that when you want to make reforms that are demanding, that are changing a lot of habits, including that habits that have been promoted by some intermediary bodies, you create a sense of unpopularity. But at the same time, I think that there is a clear willingness for the President to go to the end, because he's been elected for that. And I think that the choice which has been made in May by the French people is quite clear on the fact that we need to have some transformation. So these reforms will be fulfilled. And I think that they will create what they are aiming at, which means more dynamism for France, and an economy which will expand more than at the present time, and that will bring more employment for the French people. And of course, the second point I wanted to mention is the European Union. You yourself referred to it. And I will not start by Brexit. I'm very happy to comment and to answer your questions on Brexit. But the main point is not Brexit for us. The main point is what we want to do of the Union, and the fact that we want to strengthen it, and that we want to use France transformation also to push for a strengthening of the Union. I think that what is at stake is that the challenges we are facing are no longer on a national scale, and that was clearly explained by President Macron during the campaign for the presidency in France. And that's why we think that Europe can enable us to acquire the means to protect us in a great number of global shifts that are happening in front of our eyes. And I can refer to some of them, like climate change, obviously, I think that what we achieved, this Paris Agreement, was the example of what we need to do if we want to organize the fight against climate change, which is a big challenge, which is not related to borders, which needs international cooperation, a stronger international cooperation. The gas emissions do not stop at borders, and we want to fight. If you want to mitigate them and if you want to adapt the societies, you need an international framework to do that, and that's why we are very keen on fully implementing the Paris Agreement, and that we are gathering all the strength that we need to do that with our international partners, including Japan, which has been very instrumental, for instance, in the Hamburg G20 summit in June to defend the Paris Agreement and its implementation. I could also quote the migration challenge. Of course, migration have root causes, and you need to fight against them if you want to protect yourself from involuntary movements or movements that create also damages to the human beings themselves, like those people who are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. So you need to work on the development of the countries of origin. You need to work with the countries of transit in order to fight against all the illegal frameworks which use the situation of migrants to make it a kind of trade and to exploit the misery of these people. That needs to be done in an international cooperation at the European level firstly. This is also true for terrorism. We know very well, as was said when the Paris attacks took place in 2015, that those attacks were planned on a continent, in the Middle East actually, were programmed or organized in another country and then committed in France. And we know very well that for that we need also international cooperation to fight against financing the terrorism, against the terrorists which are committing those acts and their networks. We need to exchange information, and that also needs to be done at European and also at global level. And of course, I would like also to refer to the proliferation of nuclear arms, because we are now facing a regional and an international crisis, which is North Korea. France has been saying for a long time that the North Korean problem is a big problem that is endangering the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that is threatening the security of many countries, including Japan and, of course, now the world over. And obviously, if we want to fight against this threat, we need to cooperate internationally. So basically, on security aspect, the things are clear. On global issues also. And this is exactly the same in economy. The our economic power in the changing world needs for the European Union to be transferred, to be strengthened, because we will not be a digital champion if we are acting alone. Europe has also the power, diplomatically and militarily, if it puts its strength together, to defend our values and interests in the world of also what we see happening around us, some authoritarian regime which are trying to describe the world as something post-Western, or the values that we built together as something of the past. So we need to also address that. So, and what the President has proposed, of course, is a program of reforms, and is going to continue, and to be more precise in his proposal next week. There he will deliver a speech on the 26th of September. But he has also said, he has already highlighted a method to carry out those reforms. What he is telling us is that we need to change also of method on how we built Europe so far, and especially to give Europe more democracy. What he's proposing is a kind of roadmap that would encompass until the end of this year the sketching out of major principles of the approach that we want to pursue to strengthen Europe. And of course, if he has chosen the 26th of September to make his precise proposals, it's because also it will be after the general elections in Germany, which will take place next weekend, and which will give the opportunity of Mrs. Merkel, if she is re-elected, to contribute to this. So until the end of this year, there will be a discussion on the framework for what we see of the Union in the next few years, and also what we want to do of it, and to define our objectives clearly. And then the idea is to submit this principle and objectives to the people of Europe through a 6-month period of consultations in each member state, what President Macron has called democratic convention, because this is what we touch now upon, is the democratic issue. We need to stop considering that union can be done through talks in Brussels within closed doors, and that we need to have people brought back to the European project. And that's really what is the objective of President Macron. Third, I wanted, of course, to talk about the way that France sees its role in the world. And you know that these elections in France were quite watched and quite expected in terms of after and France now is quite expected after the results of this election has brought Mr. Macron to power. And what we need now is to contribute to solving the main challenges. I referred to some of them before. Of course, that is leading me to talk about the relationship between France and Japan. I think that France and Japan have been very close partners for a long time, and their partnership has considerably strengthened in the last few years, including in 2013 when Mr. Hollande came for a state visit and concluded or elevated our partnership to the rank of an exceptional partnership. That means that it encompasses all the areas, of course, economy, culture, and maybe I can come back to that later on if you wish, but also now the dialogue on strategic and defense issues. And we have established a 2+2 dialogue, which is allowing our ministers of foreign affairs and our ministers of defense to meet once a year and to have an agenda of cooperation progressing with these meetings. And this is a country with which we have managed to hold this rhythm for our dialogue, which is quite exceptional, because most of the time you commit for a rhythm and you're not able to manage it, to have the meetings taking place. And we have managed that, including beginning of this year when the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan came to Paris for this meeting. So we aim at developing further this dialogue and also having it producing some concrete results also in terms of cooperation in the area of armaments. And there are some companies which are working together on both sides. In the areas of economy, there was a big news in July with this summit between the European Union and Japan, with the agreement of the overall framework for an economic and partnership agreement between the EU and Japan. And I think this agreement, which now has been finalized, negotiations are going on in order to have a text ready by the end of this year or the early next year. That will offer a lot of opportunities for companies to strengthen their ties, both in terms of trade, but of course in terms of investment. In matured economy like France and Japan, the relationship cannot be seen as export-import. It's more than that. It's real economic partnerships, real partnerships between companies, and that's what we want to develop further. And there are, of course, very good examples of this partnership, like the alliance which has developed between Renault and Nissan, and which is now encompassing Mitsubishi. In the cultural area, well, you all live in Japan, you know that Japanese people are very fond of French culture, and the reverse is also true. When I see that a lot of my countries are very attracted to come to Japan, countrymen are very attracted to come to Japan for a visit and discover Japanese culture. I think that France and Japan has a specificity to place culture at the center of the social model, and that is, of course, creating a lot of human bonds that we need to exploit. There are every day a lot of exhibitions opening in Tokyo or elsewhere in Japan related to French artists. Last week, for instance, there was a big exhibition of French maîtres d'art, masters of art, which started in the Tokyo National Museum. It is called Wonder Lab, and I really recommend you to have a look at this exhibition because it's really telling a lot about the bonds that can be established between Japan and France. Although most of the maîtres d'art who have a strong Japanese influence in their art did not even know Japan before starting their art, so it's very interesting to see, and it tells a lot. There will be next year a lot of things coming that will give the possibility to strengthen even further this strong cultural partnership. I want to refer, of course, to the 160th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic relations between France and Japan. It will be in 2018. On this occasion, the Japanese government has decided to launch a cultural season in Paris in 2018 in July with the visit of Prime Minister Abe. And there will be also a lot of things that will be done and programmed here in Japan in order for France to celebrate this anniversary together with our Japanese friends. There will be also other anniversaries, like the 100th anniversary of the Chamber of Commerce in Japan, the French Chamber of Commerce in Japan, the 150th anniversary of the birth of Paul Claudel, who is one of my predecessors, but who is also, as you know, a very prominent figure in the Franco-Japanese relationship. And that will continue in 2019, when France will have the presidency of G7 and Japan the presidency of G20, so that will involve obviously a lot of coordination between our two countries. And of course in 2020 there will be the Tokyo Olympics, and you know that from last week Paris will follow, and that will give the opportunity for a lot of cooperation also in this very important field of sports that can unite our people. So what I wanted to tell you is that basically France and Japan are two partners in a globalized world. We are also working in the European framework with this economic and partnership agreement, which we want to finalize as soon as possible so that it can be implemented in 2019 before the European elections in Europe. And we are also a country, two countries which really have the same view of how the world should be organized, based on the multilateral system, based on rules, including, for instance, which is very important for Japan, the rules applying to the free navigation at sea, the UNCLOS. This is the way we see the globalization working in the interest of our people in a balanced way. And this is also the program that we share between France and Japan. Thank you very much, and I would be very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Pic. We are open to questions. When you ask a question, please come up to the microphone, state your name and your affiliation if you have one, and no speeches, please. Number one, over here.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. China is expanding its role in Asia. On one side, it calls, or it thinks the South China Sea is a Chinese sea. It's a security problem also. And on the other side, they started this kind of one road, one belt initiative. And I think the EU had some reservations with this initiative. What is France's position in both cases, this South China Sea and One Belt Road and One Road initiative?
Well, on South China Sea, I already told you what was the view of France. The view of France is that, and you know that France is a maritime power also in this region, in the Pacific with the New Caledonia and Polynesia, and also in the Indian Ocean. So we are definitely interested in the freedom of navigation at sea, which is the most important concept. In 2016, the French foreign minister was at that time the French defense minister, told in the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore that France was willing to exercise this freedom of navigation, and it did so. It did so in 2017 by sending some maritime ships to some navy in the region, and also in participating in some exercises which were organized around Guam. So we are definitely exercising this freedom, and we want UNCLOS to be implemented and respected in the region. This is our position on the South China Sea. As far as One Belt, One Road initiative is concerned, there are other initiatives also in the region, like what Japan has described as the free Indo-Pacific area. I think these initiatives, if they support regional cooperation, if they allow more exchanges in terms of trade, in terms of people, I think we need to support them. And we have to see whether they also respect a certain number of conditions, a certain number of rules applying to, for instance, development assistance. And I think there are international disciplines to which we are very attached. Those, for instance, which are promoted by the Development Assistance Committee in the OECD in Paris. So all this should be taken into account when we participate in the future in some of the concrete projects linked to either of those initiatives. And I think we have to exchange also with all the countries concerned on all that, because we have a common interest in the development of interconnection, in the development of transportation, in the development of movement of goods, but also of human beings in the region. Once again, an international order based on rules.
Next question, please. I'm sure there's people out there. Yep.
I'm Hiromu Namiki from the Japan News, newspaper published by the Yomiuri Shimbun. I want to ask a question about North Korea. Despite international condemnation, and the Kim Jong-un regime is continuing its missile launches and has conducted nuclear missiles. What actions do you think needed against the problem? Do you think that the current situation of piling more pressure on the country is going well, or as China or Russia says, some dialogue necessary to tackle the problem? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, I knew you'd ask me this question, because I understand the anxiety in this country and in the region as a whole about those provocations which are recurrent now from North Korea, whether it is ballistic missiles or nuclear tests. Once again, I would like to remind that France was one of the countries more vocal on the risk of proliferations of coming out of North Korea for a long time. You know that we participated in negotiation with Iran, and at the same time we have never forgotten what was happening in North Korea, and that's why we never established, as many other countries did, diplomatic ties with Pyongyang, because we thought that the conditions were not met to do so while there was a nuclear program or a ballistic program being continued. So I would, in order to answer your questions precisely, I think the only thing I have to do is to tell what my minister said in New York when arriving for the Ministerial Week in the General Assembly and giving a press conference. What he has been saying for a long time, and what has been said also by the President, is that first of all, the actions which are carried out by North Korea are in clear contradiction with the resolutions of the UN Security Council, and that they are threatening international security as well, of course, as regional security. including European security, because we fear that now the range of the missiles that are being tested can to some extent reach Europe. So we have condemned all those actions, and we think that we should continue with a lot of firmness what we have tried to achieve in the UN Security Council, which is the implementation of sanctions which need to be really efficient. And that's true that the sanctions that were decided in 2016, for instance, are just being put into action or being implemented right now. We need not to wait for the sanctions decided recently in 2017 to produce their results. We should accelerate the implementation, and the issue of implementation of sanctions has always been a very important thing to us. And France is determined so that the international community do its maximum pressure on North Korea, so that North Korea accept to come to the negotiation table on a good basis. And this is the only way to deal with this problem. And as my minister said and my president said, we will be very uncompromising in exercising pressure on North Korea. And that, of course, involves pressure from all countries, including and in particular from the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which means including China and Russia. So this is how we see the way to deal with this crisis.
I'm going to follow that up. My first point would be that sanctions don't seem to work. We've been doing sanctions for 25 years nearly, I think, and they've had no effect at all. The second one is France is a nuclear power, and some people may even say that North Korea has a more legitimate reason to be a nuclear power than France. France isn't likely to be invaded or attacked by Belgium, whereas North Korea feel that they could be invaded or attacked by the United States or Japan or South Korea. So in that sense, how do you balance up where France is as a nuclear power and where North Korea is?
Well, there is a big difference because France, as a member of NPT, is considered as a possessor state, and this is also in international law. So we have not acquired nuclear arms like this by doing programs which are condemned by the international community, and we are not also in our posture aggressive at all, which is of course not the case of North Korea. So you cannot compare everything. There are something which are not comparable. And I think that French deterrence has nothing to see with the proliferation crisis in North Korea. That's the first point. The second point is that, of course, there have been sanctions for many years, but that's why I was pointing out the implementation of these sanctions, as was the journalist asking the questions previously. If you don't implement them, they don't bite and they don't produce their effects, and that's what we want to achieve. And we see in other circumstances, in other cases of attempt for proliferation, that sanctions can work to bring countries to the table of negotiation and to reach good agreements. So this is possible if there is shared willingness among all countries. And the third point is what you commented on the position of the United States, so I'm not here talking about the position of others, but what I've been listening from Secretary Tillerson in the last few weeks is some kind of warranty extended to North Korea, on particular to avoid regime change and also not to push for reunification of the Korean Peninsula in an improper manner. So there are some guarantees already offered by all the players, and so the rhetoric that you used about the aggression by the United States to North Korea is basically North Korean propaganda. There is no aggression from the world international community towards North Korea, but aggression of North Korea vis-à-vis the world community. That's the situation and not the reverse.
Yes, I agree. It's the perception in North Korea of possible aggression rather than aggression itself, I think.
Yeah, that's a problem of those regimes where complete isolation prevent the people from really understanding what's happening in their own country. And there are few places in the world, very few places in the world, and And I think that's good when it can still take place. But that's another issue. It's not what we have to solve during in responding to the current crisis. What we are facing now is a crisis of proliferation of nuclear and ballistic arms.
And I'll follow up again, sorry. Yeah, I mean, the key, everyone says, is China. China could stop the oil and coal imports. How confident are you that China will actually do what the rest of the world hopes they will do?
Well, China has condemned very clearly the last drills, the last missiles and nuclear tests, and they have also supported the resolutions which were adopted unanimously in the Security Council. And I think the dialogue also is continuing with China from all states, including us, so that the sanctions are implemented very firmly in an uncompromising manner. That's, I'm using the term used by my foreign minister.
Mitsuya Goto. I've been coming to this club since 1969, and when I was asked to join Nissan Motor Company, and I got to negotiate with Mrs. Thatcher beginning 1974, and I finally put Nissan plant in the UK in '86. Over the years, it has become the largest car plant in the UK. But now that the UK decided to get out of EU, what will happen to the Nissan cars being produced in England? 70% of production is now exported to continental Europe. As you know, Carlos Ghosn now runs Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi Motor, and a few days ago he declared he'll run it the next 5 years. What will happen to the cars being exported to continental Europe?
Well, that's the issue that needs to be addressed during the negotiation taking place in the context of the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. Well, we regret that decision definitely, but it's a decision of the British people, so it needs to be respected. And that's the issue that now is dealt with within this negotiation, which basically are taking two stages. The first stage is negotiating on the UK leaving the EU. On what basis? What will be the decisions? Would the UK remain in the common market or in the customs union, or will it leave? And I understand that the discussion is continuing in the United Kingdom, although of course the intention which was announced by Prime Minister May was to leave the customs union. And if this is the case, that would of course have consequences for companies, including from third country, which are established in the United Kingdom. And then later on there will be a negotiation defining the new framework for a relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Will it be a free trade agreement? Will it be something else? That will need to be decided. So there are things which I cannot answer right at the moment, because there are things which are unclear about the decisions which are primarily also some UK decision. As far as the European Union is concerned, we are ready to negotiate. We have also a united position, and we want to negotiate in good faith and also on the basis of our own interests. We need to defend them in this negotiation, and this is what is at stake in the discussions which are taking place now between the EU, the EU 27 and United Kingdom.
on that basis, taking into account what's best for the EU and for France and for Great Britain, do you think that a soft Brexit is better than a hard Brexit?
I have always had difficulties in understanding the difference between hard and soft. This is typically some British politics that are escaping my understanding. I'm sorry about that. What I told you already is that the discussion seems to continue in the United Kingdom, and I read the press as you do, including this weekend with this interview of Boris Johnson, the political discussion that arises around it. So this is British politics, and I think from the EU we are quite clear on what we said, and we said clearly that if you want to access the internal market, you have to accept the 4 freedoms that go with it. It means freedom of movement of goods, freedom of movement of capital, freedom of movement of services, and freedom of movement of people. And those 4 freedoms are inseparable. This is what we have said since the beginning. This is a united position of the European Union. But on that basis, we can negotiate a lot of things, and we can find ways out. But first of all, we need to have a British partner which is ready to say what it wants.
I'm sure you do. Go ahead.
John Sunnelly, Ashton Consultant. Ambassador, I understand you're quite new to Japan, and you have most of your term ahead of you. So I wonder if you could give me some idea of the sort of initiatives you'd like to take on the Japan-France front in promoting relations between Japan and France.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I try to outline some of the initiatives that we will be taking in the next few years. Well, first of all, we have to maintain a very strong political dialogue between our leaders, and President Macron has already met Mr. Abe, Prime Minister Abe, in the margins of the G7 meeting in Taormina, and they hopefully will meet also today in New York if we manage to find a slot in the heavy agenda of both our leaders. I'm expecting a lot of visits in a few months' time, including, for instance, the visit of our research minister in the next, at the end of this month in the STS forum in Kyoto. I think my Minister of Research will be one of the few European ministers to attend such an important meeting, because innovation and research cooperation is very important in our relationship. And we need to continue to strengthen it, because what we see, what the Japanese government is doing, and what we see what the French government is doing, we have the same objective of making out of the digital economy, the transition to it, a matter for growth, and we need to cooperate among ourselves and among our companies so that to achieve that goal. So I'm talking about that because there is this ministerial visit, but there will be a lot of others, including ministers of defense and foreign affairs. I referred to the 2+2, so it should take place early next year in Tokyo. There will be a visit also of my economy minister. There will be visits of my transport minister, and hopefully we'll have a visit of our president at the time. There is no agenda for the moment, but this objective is clearly in my mind. In the economic front, I referred to the economic partnership agreement. That partnership agreement will be a framework, but if we want our companies to make the full benefit of it, you need to accompany them. And that will be one of my objectives, to accompany the companies, which means in trade, promoting also Japan in the French territories, in order for more companies to be attracted by making business in Japan. And for instance, when I was in a big conference of ambassadors end of August, I went in front of MEDEF International. MEDEF is the association of business leaders in France. When I started, explaining what would be the benefit of this agreement and why more companies should be attracted to the Japanese market. So that would be one of the objectives that I have. And also on investment, how we can have more French companies investing in Japan, but also more Japanese companies investing in France. France is already a big investor in Japan, but the balance is not completely reached, and we need to attract more Japanese investment in France. And so that will be, of course, one of the challenges of my mission. And in terms of culture, I already referred to a few anniversaries, but this anniversary will come with a lot of events highlighting the cultural potential between our two countries. One of the issues I didn't mention, which is very important to us, is the international mobility of students. I think if we want to achieve more, if we want to build a relationship for the long term, we need to have human ties established, and we need to have young people getting interested in doing business between our two countries, business as a generic term, of course. That means that we need to work on this, and I know that it's very difficult in Japan because you have full employment, and the companies tend to attract university students directly from universities to their companies. There was also in the press during this weekend a lot of articles about that. And so we need to develop attractivity. We need to bring more Japanese students to Japan, and also French students to Japan. But I think there are a lot of French people attracted to Japan already. So this will be also one of the priorities.
Please.
Hello. I'm Emma Charuti. I'm an intern at the Embassy of Switzerland. And I had a question. You mentioned very briefly the EU's potential military capacity. The idea of a European defense community has been in limbo for the past 60 years almost. Is this a project that the government of Emmanuel Macron would like to actively pursue? Or considering the general lack of enthusiasm for a stronger EU in Europe, and considering Brexit, is it something that is going to remain in the drawer, so to speak? Thank you.
I don't know if I really share the terms that you used, limbo, lack of enthusiasm. I think you should study a little bit more what has been achieved by the EU in the last few years, including in terms of operation, including in terms of supporting military operations, for instance, in Africa. There are a lot of things that has been done, and there are new things which need to be done, and which now are starting to be done, including through decisions which were already taken, like the launching of a structured cooperation, which is provided for by the European Union Treaty, and also some projects in terms of capacity, in terms of sharing capacity, in terms of also developing an industrial basis for the European defense. You know that the decision has been taken already by our leaders in the European Council to create a fund in order to finance the development and research for the European Union defense industry. So these things are already decided upon. We need to go further, we need to go quicker, but all the bases are already existing. So I think there is strong willingness from France, but also from other member states, in particular Germany, which has a long tradition due to the history, of course, and which has come apart from this tradition in order to participate in these developments. I was, as I told you, in the Ambassadors' Conference in Paris end of August, and there was a speech by Sigmar Gabriel, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Germany, who was quite outspoken on that, and was clearly explaining that Germany should stop, with all its reasons for not participating in some projects related to European defense. I think everybody senses now that we need to defend ourselves collectively in Europe, of course respecting what is the value added of NATO, but there is a strong willingness to do so. So I think I definitely don't share your pessimistic approach. I think with a lot of willingness, which is existing from the side of France and also from the side of Germany, we can do a lot more.
Next question, please. Siegfried.
One question more about North Korea. Is there some kind of a negotiation with North Korea? In which way should this happen? Should it at first mostly talked about abolishing nuclear weapons, or to give North Korea some security guarantees, or would it be possible to talk about freezing the nuclear weapons? In which way negotiations should happen?
Well, the issue you are raising is basically the modalities of a negotiation. And this is really what is at stake at the moment, how to come to the table of negotiation on a good basis and with the objectives which are as acceptable as possible for all countries, but in particular for the countries of the region, I mean Japan and South Korea, who are directly exposed to this threat. And this is why I think the Prime Minister of Japan and, of course, the President and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France are so tough on the pressure to exercise on Pyongyang, because we want to have good modalities in order to start for such a negotiation. So it's very difficult for me to say at the moment what would be these modalities, but the objective of Japan, and I think that they are the same with France, is to have the best basis as possible. And of course, the objective which has been announced by Prime Minister Abe is to have denuclearization. And I think we should not accept the fait accompli and consider that basically, as it was said last week to some extent by some member states in New York, that Korea is a nuclear possessor state. I think it's not acceptable at all, and it would completely damage the Treaty on Non-Proliferation. We should not accept this fait accompli. So definitely, in our view, the objective will be denuclearization. And as far as the conditions the other, of course, elements, because in a negotiation you have to reach some compromise. There are, of course, the ideas that have been put forward by the Secretary of State of the United States of America, but there are most probably other ideas. So that would be for the negotiation to decide what will be the balance introduced in it. But what is at stake now is to create, as I said, the best modalities, the best starting point for a discussion with North Korea, and definitely in respect of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation.
Any more questions out there? Or will it be me again? Okay, it's me again. You mentioned in your speech about strengthening the EU and EU reforms. In reply to that, part of the Brexit problem was that people thought that the EU was too strong or intervened too much in the life of the British people. And I think there's also some of that feeling within other European countries. So when you say strengthen the EU, can you just explain a little more what you mean by that? And what reforms do you think the EU needs? I know you've touched on some already, but
yes,
to make it more applicable in a 27 or 28 country union.
Yes. Well, I think you're right in saying that there is sometimes a feeling that the union is intervening into the daily lives of citizens, when it's not necessary. And I think when you look very carefully at the speech that Mr. Juncker gave on the State of the Union last week, he recognized that, and he said that the Union should concentrate on the most important priorities on which it has added value. He even created, he gave the mandate to the Vice President, Mr. Timmermans, to look at how the Union acts in terms of subsidiarity. I would not like to start using this terminology, which is not always very well understood elsewhere than in Europe. But basically, this is what is at stake. So we need to have a union working differently, and That's exactly what the President Macron highlighted in Athens in his speech in front of Parthenon last week. And on the objective, I mentioned the major challenges in my opening speech, on which definitely union has to act, because individually at national level we are weaker, and we need to act at the European level. So these are the things in which we need to do more, which means sometimes also to do more collectively. Doesn't exclude some transfer of powers to the Union. At the same time, when it's not necessary, Union should not act and should not give the impression to the people that it tries to regulate its everyday life. We had a discussion before entering this room about the cultural integration. I think there is no willingness to integrate European culture of each member state. Every culture has a right to live in this union and to express itself. It's a union in diversity, which we are looking at. And on the contrary, what we need to do is to bring all those cultures together, to give them more possibilities of expressing themselves. And there can be also some exchanges between cultures. We know that perfectly. So this is what we aim at. And the idea also of more democracy is very important. It's been discussed for a long time. But the new methodology that President Macron is proposing is also a way of dealing with this problem in a concrete manner and addressing the people on what they really want of the Union on the basis of the proposal that will be made to them. Once again, this was part of the democratic discussion that we had before the presidential election in France, and it can take place elsewhere, I suppose.
Okay, we're running out of time. Does anybody have any more questions? Siegfried? Why not?
I think there are some differences in the finance policy thinking of President Macron and German Finance Minister Schäuble. I think President Macron wants more a European finance policy, and Finance Minister Schäuble from Germany wants more a kind of a national finance policy. How to bridge these differences and how to deal with this problem?
Well, I think that Mrs. Merkel has expressed herself on the reforms that are proposed by Mr. Macron in supporting them, and she's the candidate for the Chancellery.
Okay, we've got time for one quick question, and it's going to be me again. Regarding Brexit, you've worked as the Secretary General of European Affairs at the Prime Minister's office. Do you think the EU could have done more to have avoided Brexit?
Well, definitely, I think there is a joint responsibility in what happened in Europe by the European governments altogether. I would not like to comment on what was the Brexit vote itself. I think it was internal British politics, mostly. But President Macron, in his speech, once again, I would like to refer to it. I invite you to read it if you have time. It's in English, but it's available on internet. But he said clearly that there was a problem of method that we faced in Europe when there was this referendum in 2005, lost in France and in the Netherlands, and when our governments decided basically to continue to try to some extent to answer the concern of the people, but basically to continue on the same methodology of working behind closed doors and avoiding interference of such referendums in the future. And that created a lot of a big gap between the peoples of Europe and their government on Europe. So basically that's what we need to address by addressing the democratic problem in the European Union construction. But at the same time, you should not underestimate what the Union has achieved. Of course, it has achieved things in sometimes difficult processes where there have been a lot of tensions also among member states, and also some very late night summit in Brussels. But at the same time, all the crises that Europe faced, we were able to face them and to resolve them. It was the case with the economic and financial crisis. We managed also to avoid Greece leaving the Eurozone. We managed the Eurozone to be still a single currency area. We managed also to launch new initiatives in terms of investment. We managed also to solve the migration crisis, which in particular Germany faced in 2016 by concluding an agreement with Turkey. We've managed a lot with a process which was maybe unsatisfactory, and in the end the process gave the impression that it was overriding the results that we achieved, and that we need to change also the methodology. And that's why the proposal of having a clear conception, a clear view of what the European Union should achieve, give it a more ambition also, because when the founding father, or not the founding father, it was later on, but for instance Mr. Delors launched the idea of a Euro zone, it was quite a revolutionary initiative, and that was supported by the people. So I think if we take such wide scope and wide-ranging initiative in the future, and we explain them to the people and we share it with them, the people will be able to support them, and we would avoid other Brexits in the future.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'd like to thank Ambassador Pic for coming here today and telling us some great things and letting us know more about France and what they're doing in the world and with Japan. And as is customary, I want to offer him a one-year honorary membership to the club and hope he comes back and buys us a few drinks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention.